Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Kathleen Hassler, board member and chair of the program committee with HAIDA, the Hawaii branch of the International Dyslexia Association, excuse me. HAIDA is proud to host and bring you tonight's event and topic, the impact of bilingualism on dyslexia, presented by Dr. Carla Garjaca. We are very pleased you are joining us for this opportunity. And we are grateful to Dr. Garjaca for sharing her knowledge and expertise to empower educators and parents in helping our bilingual learners who struggle with reading and writing skills. Before I formally introduce Dr. Garjaca, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our members, donors, and sponsors for their support in bringing events like this free webinar to our community. Your support allows us to help increase awareness of dyslexia, provide support for individuals with dyslexia, their families and educators, promote teacher training, and improve literacy for struggling readers. I especially want to thank Margaret Higa, HAIDA's Executive Director, and Dr. Kimball McCann, a fellow HAIDA Program Committee and board member, for their hard work and help in facilitating tonight's webinar. We are particularly thrilled to be offering this webinar tonight to kick off Dyslexia Awareness Month. And Dr. Garjaca, you can just advance our slide. Celebrated each October across the world. We're excited that tonight's webinar is truly a global event with participants registered from across Hawaii, other states, and countries. In fact, we'd love to know who's with us this evening. If you could, please locate the chat box. We would love to know where you are from this evening. And before we end the webinar this evening, we will share with you about other exciting events that HAIDA is sponsoring this month. Some additional logistics we'd like to point out. Your audio and video has been turned off. We kindly ask that everyone keep their audio and video off throughout this presentation so that we may provide a clear webinar experience. You are welcome to ask questions and enter them directly into the chat box, where HAIDA members and Dr. Garjaca will periodically respond throughout the webinar. So we may pause and have some conversation, and I know Dr. Garjaca has some interactive slides for us this evening. Just want to make sure I point out HAIDA's mission, which is to increase awareness of dyslexia in our community, provide support for individuals with dyslexia, their families and educators, promote teacher training, and improve literacy for struggling readers. It is now my honor to introduce our presenter, Dr. Carla Garjaca. Dr. Carla Garjaca is the CEO and founder of Globally Brighter, whose mission is to empower and support people to face their personal and educational challenges. Dr. Garjaca's passion for education started early. At age 15, she was already teaching her first language classes. She started her career as a foreign language teacher in one of the largest Brazilian foreign language schools. Years later, she was invited to work as the coordinator in one of its branches. Dr. Garjaca also specialized in the fields of pedagogy and linguistics. Intrigued by the role of the brain in the second language acquisition process, she pursued a master's degree and later a doctorate in educational psychology, with minors in linguistics, cognitive psychology, and neuropsychology. In parallel, she was teaching graduate students at National Louis University in Chicago. Dr. Garjaca also dove into the nutritional psychology field as a way to have a more holistic understanding of the complex and intriguing relationship between the brain and the gut, the so-called second brain. I will now turn it over to Dr. Carla Garjaca. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, thank you. So first of all, I would love to say that I'm very honored to be part of this presentation to this webinar in October, right? Which is a very special month for dyslexia a community. So thank you. I'm very, very honored to be here. Again, I would love to highlight the fact that I do want everyone's participation. So if you do have questions, please do interact. It would be, very important for you to participate. So even though we are on Zoom, it's really important to, to share your, ideas, concerns, and questions, right? So, Kathy, I do have a question. Do you have the results for the where our participants are from? Do you have any idea?
I do. I'm going to go through our chat list right now and call out some of the participants who have entered. We have Aloha from Honolulu, Dr. McCann.
Hello.
Donna from Honolulu. And forgive me if I don't say names correctly, but Zanadia from Illinois. Tina from the UK. Lisa from Maui. I have Rachel from Washington State, Carrie from Kailua, Hawaii, Sheila from Illinois, Shaida from Malaysia, welcome, Sarah from Canada, but currently working in Turkey, Brenda from Illinois, Jennifer from Honolulu, our fellow board member, hello, Miss Leowiki, and Janet, hello from Louisiana.
Great, welcome everybody. So we do have people, all over the world here, some countries, different countries. So welcome, welcome. I'm very, very honored to be here. All right, so should we start? Are we ready? Can I
We are.
Okay, all right. So let me go over a little bit what we're going to be talking about during this webinar, right? So our roadmap here. So first of all, I would love to get to know my audience. So Kathy's going to help me with some questions. So I would love, to ask some questions about, if you're bilingual, if you're not bilingual, or how fluent you are. Then we are going to talk about bilingualism and demographics around the world. Third, actually, we're going to talk about bilingualism per se and really understanding what it means to be bilingual and how that affects a language learning or language difficulties or any language challenges that a child may be facing. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about similarities and differences. After that, signs to look for, and the last part of our presentation is going to be really hands-on. Great tips, things that we could do in order to try to assess and really diagnose more effectively our bilingual and dyslexic kids. All right, great. I'm very, very excited. So let's go to our next slide. So the question is, I would love to know if you guys are bilingual, right? So if you are bilingual, can you please answer the question yes or no, so we can have an idea whether you guys are bilingual or not. And the second question is, how proficient are you in your second language? So we have 5 possibilities. So you just put A, B, C, D, or E, right? Are you bilingual? Is very simple, yes or no, but I would also like to know how proficient you are if you consider yourself bilingual. So letter A is, yes, I understand very well, but have a hard time speaking. So it's basically you listen, you can understand, but you struggle when you're speaking. Letter B is I speak fluently. So you're very, you can communicate very well. Letter C, you can read and write, but you cannot speak. It's the opposite, right? You can read books and you can write, but when it comes to speaking, you struggle a little bit. Letter D, I'm very fluent on both. So I can basically read and write and speak and listen to any language. And letter E is like, okay, I can survive. You know, if you throw me in Paris, I can, you know, I'm not gonna die, right? I can go to the supermarket and, you know, basically do the basic things. All right. So I'm gonna wait just a little bit for you guys to try to answer the questions. And welcome, I know some people are coming in. Welcome, welcome. My name is Carla Garjaka. And again, just feel free to ask me questions throughout the presentation. I'm gonna be talking sometimes a little bit about theory, you know, some theoretical background. So if you do have questions, please, please let me know so you can understand more thoroughly. All right, so do we have any results, Kathy?
Yes, just a quick tally. We had approximately 7 responses for yes, 4 responses for no, and the ranges of proficiency, I had 1A, 3B, 3D, and 1E so far, and a kind of 2.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So we have 3D, 1A. So we had almost, except C, right? We didn't have I can read and write. The C, letter C was.
I did not see C, no.
Okay.
Oh, an AC, A/C. I did one of those.
All right. Okay. Thank you. It was very interesting. So we have most of them were bilingual in our results, right? Yes, they are bilingual. Okay, great. All right. So why did I ask this question, right? Well, if we take a look at the whole world population, the majority of us, we are bilingual. Like, you know, if so, bilingual people are the majority, which is great, right? Even though, you know, sometimes we don't really see ourselves as bilingual, but the majority of us is bilingual. And this is a very important fact, which means we really now more than ever, and the idea is because of globalization and even Zoom meetings, we have Zoom meetings all over the world, that we have more need of becoming bilingual. So this is a trend that it's just going to happen more and more. And the thing is, we have to have a better understanding of what bilingual really means. And I think this is one of the things, a myth that many people have a hard time understanding, right? So what is bilingualism? What does it mean to be bilingual, right? And some people judge bilingual people just by listening and say, oh my God, you're bilingual. You speak English and you speak Portuguese. You're so smart, right? So we tend to judge bilingualism most of the times based on speech. So the first thing that I want you guys to understand in this presentation is that speech is very, it's just one component of bilingualism, right? So sometimes I can go to, for instance, I can go to Paris and I can kind of speak French, but I really don't consider myself like I can speak French, even though some people can say, oh, you speak French, that's interesting. And I say, no, I don't. And people say, yes, you do, right? So we have this different perception. Another myth is, if you speak without any accent or just like a native, with native like fluency, people will consider you a true or very good speaker, right? So with no accent, oh my God, you speak English so well. So, and so those are comments that I really like you guys to think more in depth as we go into this presentation, because we are basically judging people very superficially. And when we are dealing with language difficulties or language challenges in a school setting, in an academic setting, those things can really influence the development of the language, okay? So for you to have an idea, most bilingual, even though the majority of the people around the world, they are bilingual, but most of them are not fluent in all 4 language skills, right? So some people can be trilingual or polyglots, but it's really, really hard to be biliterate or triliterate, right? Which means you are able to speak, read, write, and listen fluently in all languages, right? So this is really hard. So the minority of them. And why this is so hard? Because language is, I always compare language with something that is alive. If you don't feed your language components, it's gonna die. So even though, for instance, I'm from Brazil, by the way, if you guys don't know, I forgot to tell, I'm from Brazil. So my Portuguese is my first language, but I've been in the United States for 15 years. So most of my studies, academics, you know, I do in English, I study in English, I write in English. So sometimes when I go to Brazil to make a presentation, it's interesting, I have to practice sometimes twice more because all those academic names I'm so used to saying in English. So when I have to say in Portuguese, I say, okay, I have to think more. So, oh, you know, even though it's my first and dominant language. So depending on the context, I struggle a little bit more because that's where I use most of the times in English. Right, I work in English, and so once in a while, like twice a year, 3 times a year, I go to Brazil and I do a presentation. So it's not very often. So it's very difficult for you to be biliterate because you literally have to practice those skills every day. Very important data is like, if you want your child, or if you really want to keep up being biliterate, you have to practice both languages at least, I would say 30 to 40% during the day you have to dedicate to a language. So if you're in the United States and you want to keep with your Portuguese or with your French or with your Chinese, at least 30% of your day you have to dedicate to your second language in ways that you can read and write and practice the other components, okay? So, so it's really common that bilinguals usually have a dominant language, right? Usually it's the strongest language, and not necessarily the dominant language is the native language. Not necessarily the dominant language is gonna be the mother's language, right? So a good example is my own daughter. She, since first time, she, from birth, I always spoke in Portuguese every day, every second of her life. But her dominant language is definitely not Portuguese. That I can guarantee, right? It's not Portuguese, it's English. So again, it's another type of myth that we say, oh, you speak Spanish at home. Oh, so your dominant language is Spanish. So don't make those judgments, especially when we're dealing with academic issues, okay? Okay, so key information about bilingualism that we have to, that I'm exposing to you guys. Most bilinguals are not equally proficient, right? Most of them. So even though we have the majority of the world is bilingual, most of them are not equally proficient. Second, bilinguals usually don't speak both languages equally, basically because it's different contexts, different activities, different needs, right? So if I have a student whose mother speaks Spanish, most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, and that's based on my experience as a bilingual psychologist, that student is fluent in the speech and listening skills, but not reading and writing, right? So, and that's really important to understand, right? So which component or which proficiency the child is bringing to the table, right? So don't, oh, he speaks Spanish all the time with grandma and with grandpa, or Chinese. Okay, so how is the mother reading to him? So those are very important information that we have to collect when making any type of diagnosis with bilingual kids. Proficient bilingual demonstrates both accuracy and fluency, right? If you're proficient bilingual or biliterate, or you are able to speak, listen, read, and write very fluently in both languages, this is really rare because it's really a struggle. So for instance, I consider myself bilingual, even though I speak, Spanish and other languages, but I am biliterate in Portuguese and English. But I have to confess that I really force myself to read in Portuguese, to speak is easy, but to write in Portuguese, right? In order to keep up. And that I usually do because of my work, right? Because I have to, and I want to, I do presentations, I write books and everything, and articles in Portuguese, but that's something that I have to do. If I didn't have to do those works, in Portuguese, if I just gave up and said, I'm just going to focus in English, I would lose my biliteracy in Portuguese. So I would probably be more literate in English than in Portuguese. So it is possible for you to lose your literacy level in your native language if you don't use them. And there are many cases, many situations that you're gonna see that. This is not rare. Actually, this is very common, okay? So another thing that I want to emphasize to you guys, there are many native speakers who are not even fluent as well. So we have this idea that, oh, you're from the United States, you speak English, you're fluent in English, right? We already make this deduction that, no, there are many native speakers that bilingual, like me, as a bilingual person, in English is not my first language. I might speak proficiently better than him who was born here. And that's normal because it depends on the education, on your academic skills, how many books you read. There's so many variables. So sometimes, I hear people, oh, you speak Spanish, so you can teach Spanish. You can be a Spanish teacher. I said, no, not everybody who speaks English or Spanish or Chinese can teach the language, because it doesn't mean you're proficient, right? So we are gonna have this same issue, especially when assessing language difficulties. We are focusing on dyslexic here, kids. There are some native speakers who are not even proficient in English, right? Even though they're monolingual. So this is something we really need to focus and pay attention, okay? And why? Because for you to survive in the world, or in a city, or in a country, with basic 3,000 words, you can communicate, you can go to the hospital, you can go to the supermarket, you can talk to friends, you can party, you can drink, you can have fun, you can do anything. And it's a very limited vocabulary, and you can do anything, and you can even pretend that you know the language, right, with 3,000 words. That's why there are many courses, foreign language courses. Learn the language in a month, right? Learn the language 2 months, because the idea is like, you don't need many or different vocabulary words to survive, right? With just basic vocabulary words, you can survive. So, and that is tricky when we are diagnosing bilingual kids, because if kids can be very fluent, speak very well the language, but we don't see the underlying problems, what is below that, okay, underneath of what you really see when you're speaking to the person, okay? So now native level fluency, it's between, and this is not really academic, it's around 20 to 40,000 words. So imagine from 3 to 20. It's a big gap, right? A big gap. And we cannot ignore this gap. We cannot just say, oh, just take for granted that he or she knows all those more academic vocabulary words, because this is really important. All right. Okay. So why is this important? Why do we have to pay attention on basic fluency? Are you native like fluency? What I see is not exactly what I get when it comes to language difficulties. Why do I care about language domains, reading and writing, and the complexity of the writing by literacy? If you are, if you're not, why do I really care about that? Well, basically, because what you see is not necessarily the reality. So my first big tip that I want you guys to really get after you leave this webinar is, okay, from now on, when I am speaking, when I'm talking to a person who is bilingual and is struggling academically and is struggling to really understand the reading and writing components of the language, we really need to conduct an in-depth investigation, right? We cannot just say, let's wait and see. And tip number 2, if a person, it could be a psychologist, it could be a teacher, parents, whoever, if somebody tells you, oh, he's having a hard time because he's bilingual, please stop this person immediately and say, no, bilingualism does not cause any problems. Being bilingual does not cause any problems, right? Now, what you're doing or how you're using the languages that you have inside your brain, that might cause problems. But just the fact that he's bilingual and using this sentence, oh, because he's bilingual, we have to wait more. Because he's bilingual, it does not make any sense. I've been in this field for, almost 30 years, and I see this excuse or this comment very often. Okay, we have to wait a little bit because he's bilingual. So no, why? You really have to understand why you have to wait. Because he's bilingual is not an explanation, right? For a person who really is struggling academically, we have to understand why. Oh, because he's mixing language, why he's mixing languages, why his reading is not progressing. It's not because he's bilingual, right? So those are the 2 tips that I want you to really understand. And I'm gonna explain why this is so important for you to understand, okay? Do we have any questions, Kathy? Can I go on?
I just saw one question from Dr. McCann. I see bilingualism as a strength. Is that wrong?
No, bilingual, this is not wrong. Bilingual is a strength. However, how sometimes we mix languages or how we use languages can be detrimental, all right? So for instance, I can give an example. Some people say, oh, it is okay to mix Portuguese with English or Chinese with English or Spanish with English. We see a lot. And people say it's okay to mix. And what I tell is, yes, it is okay to mix language because it's a developmental process, but it should not be the norm. What I mean by that, it's a process, right? I'm gonna mix the language because that's why I think it's really important to understand the why. I am mixing languages because I don't know the vocabulary or I'm not familiar with the vocabulary in the other language. So I might just mix the language and go from there, right? But if I keep mixing the languages, it means my vocabulary is gonna be very restricted because I'm gonna think that there is not a good vocabulary word in that language, and that can be detrimental. So bilingualism is a plus. But what I see more and more is people really don't understand what is normal, and they turn the normal into a norm. And then the kid keeps mixing the languages, especially younger kids, because the brain, exactly the same part of the brain is dedicated for two languages. And the brain does not know which language is English, which language is Portuguese, which language is Spanish. So if they are mixing, the brain basically thinks it's the same language, unless a person tells, oh, this is English, oh, you're mixing, oh, you know, so the brain is learning, right? When we grow older and we learn a second language later, which is my case, that's why I have an accent, the brain dedicates a different part. They are together, but it's kind of different. So this is Portuguese, this is English, right? But when you're a child, it's kind of everything's together. So that's why they usually mix languages. So bilingualism is a benefit. But if you do have any languages difficulties, it's something that you can work with, but you have to pay attention to those details that I'm going to be explaining to you. Okay?
Carla, we had one more question, if it can connect to this point. If you have thoughts about translanguaging in primary students.
Okay, yeah, translanguaging. So that's, again, one topic. So translanguage, now everybody's talking about translanguaging. They, oh, it's good, it's the best thing. Again, I have mixed feelings because it really depends how we are using. If you are proficient bilingual, right, translanguaging is very beneficial, right? However, as I, you know, in the beginning of my slides, not many people is bilingual, proficient bilingual. So the brain is still not sure how to use translanguaging, right? So it depends on the age of the child. It depends on how fluent is the child. It depends on how much vocabulary the child has to really benefit from translanguaging, right? So it's really, there are so many ifs that sometimes I rather, you know, if the child is really young or if it's really struggling, try to really pay attention on the benefits, right? Because sometimes we are overusing, it's the same with code switching or mixing languages. The myth is like, it's normal, and now becomes a norm, right? What is normal not necessarily is the norm. Translanguage is one strategy that can be used. It's not something that you should use every single time. So that's wrong. If the child is code switching or mixing languages every single time, there is a language problem going on, right? Translanguaging, we have the brain has to think about when to use it. If the brain is just using randomly, it's not being beneficial, right? So that's the thing when you guys should pay attention. Okay. All right, so let's go to the next slide. This is a very exciting slide. I love this slide because if you are bilingual and if you have a bilingual background, probably you know what I'm going to be talking about. But the idea is the iceberg theory, right? When we see languages, everybody who is not an educator, who is not a bilingual specialist, will see, oh, he speaks two languages, that's so cool, you know, and we get very excited and we start judging a lot based on the fluency, native-like, accent, you know, all those components, right? However, there is a big secret that I want to share with you guys, which is the next slide, right? So when we see an iceberg, right, we see the top. That's what happens with the Titanic, right? You see only 20%, and that's exactly what happens when we are talking to children who are struggling linguistically. When we speak to this child, we just see the top 20 and sometimes even less than 20%. This is nothing. This is really nothing when it comes to language, right? As language experts, we really have to dive deep. You see how much in depth we have to go. This is truly, we have to go 80% more, right? Investigate 80% more to really understand what is going on, right? So then, so the top of the iceberg is what we call, and this is a term that Cummings really came up with. I really like his term, and there are, you know, many other studies after him, but I'm gonna use him as a reference because I really like to acknowledge his theory, because it really gave a very good understanding of what happens with bilingual kids when in the process of language development. So the thing is, BICS is the basic interpersonal communication or social language, right? It's the language that we use to socialize. And usually the vocabulary, it's very limited. You know, as I said before, 3,000 words we can survive, we can communicate. So it's what we see. It's how people judge us. If, you know, if a person would hear me and I have an accent, the person is gonna judge me, oh, maybe she's not so fluent, maybe she's not very, you know, smart, whatever, what type of judgment the person's doing is basically on my social language, whatever I'm speaking there, right? But we have the academic language, which is the hidden part of the language that we usually don't see. But when we're dealing with language difficulties, that's where we have to go. That's where we have to dive into to really get the grasp, to really understand, and not say, oh, he's bilingual, and that's the reason why he's not, you know, developing, right? And that's the academic vocabulary, understanding, following rules, and know what to do, and paying more attention, focusing. All those things are more cognitive challenging, and that's where we have to understand. Now, the second very important part is the CUP, which means the common underlying proficiency. What those languages have in common, which means in order for you to develop a second language, you have to have a good foundation in the first language. You have to have CULP. If you don't have CULP in neither of the languages, you can never grow beyond 3,000 to 5,000 words. Your vocabulary growth, your language growth is going to be very limited, right? Very limited. That's why sometimes we try, many universities, they offer free programs for foreigners, for, you know, immigrants, and some teachers, they struggle, say, she cannot go beyond that. Well, she can't, because if her first language literacy, if she's kind of, you know, we call semi-literate, is like she can survive in her first language, that's how much she can do in the second language. So the CUP is whatever you have in your first language is gonna be transferred to your second language. So if your first language is very weak in terms of academic skills, you cannot move on. The second language can never suppress the first language competency, right? But if you're very competent in the first language, you can grow as much as you want in your second language. Even the second language can overgrow the first language if you don't use the first language anymore. But you need this solid foundation. So that's why I really want you guys to understand how important the CUP, you know, in order to transfer. So imagine this CUP is kind of a bridge. It's where they're going to communicate. Languages are always communicating. They are transferring knowledge, transferring vocabulary, transferring everything. So if you know all the images that you have about a car in about a car in Portuguese, will transfer as at the first moment I hear the word car, my brain is going to bridge out and say, oh, I know what car is, right? It's immediate. That's what happens, right? So there is a straight communication between the CULP, right? And that's where we're going to have the foundation. And that's how we're going to see the level of the basic communication skills. So if you don't have a very good CULP, a very good foundation, you're not going to have a very strong communication. Your communication skills are going to be very limited. All right. So next one, I'm going to summarize the most important things so far, because I think there are many important points. And if you do have any questions, I can, help you out. So point number one, bilingual does not necessarily indicate that the speaker is fully competent in two languages. And when I mean about fluent, again, it's be able to read and write and speak. So if I ask you, write a letter, a summary of this webinar in two languages, you would be able to do very fast without a problem, right? That is biliteracy. Then bilinguals, more likely, they have various levels of language domains, and that's normal. That's totally normal. That's the majority. But then we have to investigate how that will play when we are learning a second language. And bilinguals, it's just when usually in a normal setting is when we're speaking two languages. That's usually what we refer to bilingual people. But when it comes to academic, again, we have to go more in depth and really understand. Okay, all right. Any questions, Kathy? Can I move on?
I'm getting a clarifying question. Just want to read it very quickly so I can articulate it correctly. To clarify, refugee students who have been out of school for a significant amount of time, thus lacking proficiency, are going to struggle immensely in the second language. Additional follow-up, is there something that we can do to increase their cup?
Yes. So very good question. And that is also important because sometimes with refugees, their first language is really, the basic language. So we have to really focus on the call. And we're going to do that in English, right? Because we have to choose. So usually I tell educators, like, if you are working with, sometimes it happens with very low socioeconomic status kids, right, who are coming to the education setting and have very low call, choose the language that is spoken in that country, right? So sometimes you say, oh, okay, he speaks Spanish or he speaks Chinese, so let's really try to do the intervention in Chinese or in Spanish. Don't do that. Focus in English. You can still use the communication skills, the call or the bigs in the native language, but when it comes to academic, you really need so many resources. And sometimes what happens is you don't have those resources available in the country or in your school setting or in your state. So you're going to struggle, and this child is already struggling. So there are a lot of things that we can do. It depends obviously on the age of the child. There's so many variables that I'm not going to go in depth with those variables. But if you do want to, chat more about it, I can really talk about, if it's a teenager, if it's a younger, obviously the younger the child, the easier it is for us to do an intervention. And it has to be a very intense type of intervention. Okay, but yeah, it's a very good question, and we do have to pay attention to the type of help the child is bringing, and always choose the language that we are going to have more resources available for the intervention. Okay. All right.
I have one more, Carla. One more question. So if we know the language and have the resources, we can focus on increasing cup in their native language. That's the question.
Okay, so if you have the resources, again, it really depends on the age, but let's suppose the child is kindergartner, right, with no call. This child, so it's not only about having the resources today or 1 year from now. If the child has a very low call, this child will need an intervention for at least 5 to 7 years, okay? in that language, okay? And don't try to do Spanish and English at the same time, right? With at risk, because those kids are considered at risk. Don't try to do that. If you are able to do that for a long period of time in that language, maybe after 5 years you can really implement the academic English, then yes. So again, this is a very important question, because sometimes we think, oh, we have the resources here now, you know, we have all the books for 1 year, right? It's not enough, right? So you're doing a disservice, because after 2 years, then we're going to transition to English and it's going to have a problem. And that can lead to language challenges and sometimes cognitive challenges and then learning disabilities, right? So sometimes I tell always teachers, we have to know that it takes time. If the child already lost, right, 5, 7, 6 years without an academic language, we have to kind of recover, go back and try to do that. And there is also emotional trauma and everything going on. So it's not less than 5 years. You will not be able to do any intervention in less than 5 years. And obviously during this intervention, you're going to see if there is any language challenges throughout this. And I'm going to give some clues. If, for instance, this child might be dyslexic and we don't know. But think about long-term. Whenever you do intervention with children, think long-term. Usually, average 5 years is the minimum for a very intense intervention for kids who are refugees or at-risk kids. Okay? All right, so let's go to the next slide, which is basically what to look for when assessing bilingual children. So always we're gonna compare first language versus second language. And again, first language could be the native language, could be the mother language, could be, you know, not necessarily the mother language, but, you know, we have to think about that. So we have to think about BICS. So always think about BICS, even though this is not the most academic slide, but BICS try to think about the social language, speaking, listening. So the writing, it's more complex. So I always compare with the COLP, right? Even though we can use a lot of, right now, for instance, in this webinar, I'm speaking, I'm using much more COLP than BICS, right? And you guys have a lot of COLP to be able to understand my presentation. But so this is a very rough representation of what BICS and COLP really mean. But that's what usually how we judge people. So if the person is speaking and language is very limited, listening, sometimes the child struggle even following directions, paying attention, you know, or, you know, even following a book, probably the COLP skills are kind of low, right? So what we have to look for when we have a child coming with only social language. So basically, what is the characteristics of BICS, right? The child is very talkative. Sometimes they love to chat, have a very good language knowledge to communicate, to survive, which is about 3,000 to 5,000 words, not a lot, but can be tricky. But the signs are, usually this child has had a very limited listening skill exposure, which means, you know, parents usually didn't talk too much. It was very usually direct, straightforward directions. Let's do this, go there, very use of imperatives. Usually children who are coming from low socioeconomic status, one of the things that I do with my students is to ask them to observe a child who's coming from a very low, or even go to a supermarket in a very low socioeconomic neighborhood and just observe how parents interact. It's very straightforward, a lot of use of imperatives. No, we cannot do that. No, we don't have money. Okay, that's it. Let's go out. You know, there is not much interaction, and that obviously limits the amount of vocabulary word, the child is gonna listen. And obviously, if you don't listen to many vocabulary words, you're not gonna be able to speak. So the child has difficulty paying attention because when we read, reading is one of the best exercise to enhance attention. Actually, reading and exercise, actually, right? To do aerobic exercise with children. So children nowadays, as a psychologist, I see more and more people struggling, children struggling with attention and focusing. It's basically because of technology, right? And also lack of reading, because books really force us to pay attention and to focus, right? We get involved into the story. So there is a shift on our attention when we're reading. So if the child who was never exposed to books, he's gonna, have some attention deficits. And obviously limited speaking. So if you do see some of those characteristics, like the child is not paying attention, I cannot even finish a 5-page book, 6-page book he's 5 years old, try to really go back and investigate a little bit of what happened in the past. And another important question is, did this child, or was this child exposed to books before the age of 5? Or if so, for how many minutes per day, or every day, or once a week? How long was this exposure? This is so important. So I always tell teachers, we need to be very good observers. We really need to investigate, to interrogate, to question parents, to get informed about what happened to this child before saying, oh, it's because he's bilingual, right? So again, I don't want you guys to say that sentence. It's not because he's bilingual. Let's see what type of bilingualism this child was exposed to. Because if nobody read to this child, not so much communication skills, okay, so we can already see, oh, this child is not really fluent reading, not fluent in writing, even though he's 5, but we have some writing skills already showing up when you're 5. And the listening is very limited, like not paying attention. So those are very good signs for us to, okay, let me try to investigate more before, making any judgments, okay? All right, so how common is this type of student? So that's a very interesting question, because we know that most of the population is bilingual, but not very few of them are biliterate, right? What about students? When they come to our classroom, what is usually the student's profile? So nationally, while in the United States, this is the data from the United States, so sorry for those who are not from the United States, but 25% of caregivers never, ever read with their children, never. So this is a very important data, because we are talking about refugees or children with low socioeconomic status. But we have 25, and this is not only bilingual, actually bilingual kids, we have even bigger number. I think for bilingual kids, we have around 40%, 38, if I'm not mistaken. So that the parents never read to them, right? So we have a Spanish speaker student, or a Chinese speaker student, or a Japanese speaker, and he is bilingual. And then we're gonna say, oh, you speak Spanish at home? I'm gonna do any Spanish intervention. So, we have to think about whether a Spanish intervention is indeed the best scenario. Because if the child has never ever seen a book in his whole life, right? How are you gonna start an intervention? Again, you have to pick and choose, and you have to think longitudinal. You have to think about how many years this child will need to have a good intervention, right? So this is really important. So this is also very important for native speakers, right? Even though we're not focusing here, but 25% of native speakers, this data is for monolingual, right? And then those monolingual children will also have difficulties learning how to read and write, and they will struggle. And then we have to really figure it out whether is this child dyslexic or really have some language problems because of lack of exposure, lack of, not books, those kind of things. So this is something you really need to pay attention, because it's now more and more we have those kids coming from schools without having a very good language background support, right? The COLP. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next slide, which I love this slide as a neuropsychologist, right? The brain growth. I'm not going to focus too much on the brain here, even though I love it. But you see here, let's focus on the first 5 years.
Excuse me, Carla, before you go on, there's a question in the chat. Okay. I wonder if you could address, because I think it's speaking to what, so it's talking about a child who's been in their English speaking program for 3 or more years, 6 years old, and still not able to communicate verbally in a complete English sentence. They understand what's being said, directions are followed, but if you ask a simple question, like, what are you doing? It's answered with one word. Okay. So any comments on that, or is that something you want to take up later?
I can comment. It's a very complex question, because we have to really dive deep into, because we have to see the language background. If the child is coming from only BICS instead of COLP, right? And if that is the case, what type of intervention? Because usually for bilingual children, on average, usually if the child has a good language foundation, which means COLP, it takes approximately 6 to 8 months for us to see progress, moving from level 1 to level 2, even to level 3. So usually level 1 to 3, it's very easy, the growth, right, of the language, because if you have COLP, right? If you do not have COLP, we really need to think about what type of intervention we have been doing with that child, right? And the intervention has to be connected with the language background input, right? If it is very limited, no reading, are remixing languages, so there are many variables. So again, if you do want me to go more in depth, I would love to talk to you about this child and give you some hint. We can do like a type of case study, but it's really hard to really diagnose and say, maybe this child has a problem with language or not, right? So you can just email me, and I think my email is in the first slide. If it's not, I can, or Margaret, can you just write my email in case,
Oh, okay, I see it on your, oh no, yeah. Your website on the slide. Do you want me to put your email in the chat?
Yeah, you can put my email in case people want to, ask some questions, or be fine. Okay. So, well,
okay. And is that the one we've been using, Carla?
Yeah, you can use the Hotmail, or because I have the Globally Brighter one, but I don't think you guys have it. That's
okay. I'll put that one in there. Thank you, Carla.
You're welcome. So, okay. So that question actually, it flows very well with my next slide, which is the brain growth, right? So again, imagine the brain growth more than 90% in the first 5 years of the child life. And this is really focused more on the language aspect of, on the attention aspect, on the visual aspect. So everything connected to language comprehension, imagination, everything is really it's really growing in this first 5 years of life, right? So usually when kids go to kindergarten, they are 5 or 6 year old, really, and whatever happened before, sometimes we tend to ignore, right? But the brain has already been formed. 90%, 90 of the brain is already there. It's formed with connections, more connections or less connections, we don't know, right? But it's there. So whatever happens after the 5 years, which is usually they're gonna be focusing much more on the frontal lobe, right? Especially during the teenage years, after 11, 12, that's why it's so hard, because by 10, if the child has been diagnosed with some language difficulties after 10, it's much, much, much harder to do something, because you see 98% of the brain has been already, you know, grown by that time, right? So that's why the earlier, the better, because the brain is still adjusting. But unfortunately, with bilingual kids, we tend to wait. And I see personally, as a psychologist, many parents look for a psychologist after 5th grade, because when they reach 5th grade, they're like, oh, there is so much content, so much academic, my kid cannot handle it, right? And I say, why did you wait so many years? And usually it's because educators are not, they don't know about that. And we tend to wait and we tend to blame the language. Oh, because he's bilingual, right? And it's not because he's bilingual, right? There is bilingualism, again, does not cause any problem. Actually, it's beneficial, because if you're bilingual, you're forced to use your frontal lobe much more effectively than if you're not bilingual. So actually you're using more parts of the brain, right, than a monolingual student. So again, don't say it's because he's bilingual, because it's not a problem. The reason could be because he was not exposed to a language, because he was not read to, because of, you know, so try to really understand the why, right? So, and we do a thorough investigation. If you are a teacher or a psychologist that who is working with bilingual kids, you do have to investigate the first 5 years of life. You do have to know what type of bilingual the type of bilingualism the child is bringing to the table. It's really important. I think I cannot emphasize more than I am emphasizing right now, because it's going to be impossible to really diagnose, okay? So the language input during the first 5 years. So the quality of the language, and there is so many research and studies on that. I put just some of them here, but if you're interested in learning more articles on the importance of language, listening skills, you know, it's actually, I developed a program for preschoolers specifically focusing on how the brain works and the importance of language, the importance of listening skills, the importance of reading, and how we read to really stimulate all the brains. It's a very interesting research that I did for 5 years, just looking at the brain and how we can really enhance language during those first 5 years, because I see personally more and more problems when it comes to language. More than ever. You know, after I finished my doctorate like 10 years ago, almost, we have more problems than before, even though the technology is kind of growing. But anyways, so the quality is really important. So we really need to investigate what I mean by quality. How we communicate with the child, if we play games, what type of games. Games are so important, right? Board games, right? And also any like hopscotch, those kind of games are really good in terms of language, believe it or not, right? Because it activates the brain. So it's really reading. I cannot say enough about the importance of reading, right? Low language environment, how that will specifically connect with language or with academic problems at school, right? It's many studies on that. And Hart and Risley, the study that I showed there was one of the most important studies that was conducted, and there were many others even criticizing them, but I think the point that they're making, it's still very valid nowadays. And so the important is we have to focus on the language quality, the ambient of the language, so we can know how well developed this language has been throughout those 5 years. Okay? All right, so this is a very interesting picture. So the BICS and Language Foundation. So what we see usually, especially with kids with limited language, we see, 1, 2, 3, 4 languages. That's the top of the iceberg. So limited language foundation equals limited comprehension, limited language output. Okay, and then that will lead to academic challenges. So if we diagnose these limitations, those limitations very early on, it's much easier to really understand where the problem is. If it is a difficulty, if it is only challenges, or if it is really a diagnose, like, okay, there is a challenge, an academic, like we call a disability per se. Because I've seen, as a psychologist, many parents calling me and say, okay, my kid was diagnosed with a language disability, but they don't know the name of it. And I say, really? They're kind of, how? It's like, they don't know, but it's just a language disability and they have no idea why. So, okay, so let's investigate. And most of the times, I would say 90% of the times when I assess the child has no disability. It's just language, lack of language foundation, right? So please don't tell parents if it is a disability or, something that you don't know. We really have to understand, right? So look for a specialist, a bilingual person, a person who can really understand that. All right? Okay, any questions? Do you have questions, Kathy or Margaret?
No new ones right now.
Perfect. Okay, so let's move on.
Okay.
Okay, now we're gonna go into BICS and dyslexia. Okay, so usually what are the signs dyslexia people show versus what low social and low academic skills students show? I think it's really important because most of the times what happens with bilingual kids who are coming at school with a very low socioeconomic very low language background, we tend to wait for so many years and say, okay, let's wait. Maybe this person is also dyslexic and we're just waiting and blaming on the language. So it's very common to have a low socioeconomic and never being diagnosed. Even the parents were never diagnosed, right, before, due to the socioeconomic status. So there are some symptoms that we know usually dyslexic people have, like chronic ear infections, delay in establishing a dominant hand, right? That's a very important, I think, information sometimes that I use just, to get some check marks and really do an investigation. And those are signs that we can clearly see very early, right? And we can combine with other signs when it comes to language. Confusion with left and right. So usually this is not something that happens with bilingual kids, right? So don't blame, because he's bilingual, he's confused. And I've seen educators say, oh no, because he doesn't know left and right in English. And I said, well, no, we can play games, there's so many things. And later on, I'm going to show you very nice ideas on how to assess kids with games. Trouble in learning to tie shoes. It's a very also interesting aspect. Odd pronunciation. So there is a difference between, like me, I have an accent. And so this is very unique to dyslexic. It's not the same problem you see with bilingual kids. So bilingual kids, we have problems pronouncing, for instance, my example, or like the vowels, right? The plural, man and man, I don't even know if I said man and man, or cup and cap, those kind of things. Vowels are, depending on your language background, is a problem. If you have, if you speak Chinese, to say the R and L might be a problem, right? So we know, and you can Google on the internet, there are so many interesting presentations on that. And if you want to know more, that are specific to bilingual kids and how they struggle with pronunciation. And pronunciation struggles with dyslexic kids, it's very different, very unique. So if you see like a person say Intn'l instead of animal, right? And all the time, like instead of saying spaghetti, say spaghetti, or enemy instead of enemy, right? Those are not regular, average bilingual kids' problem with pronunciation. So I really want to emphasize, because that's a red flag. Don't say, oh, it's because he's, again, bilingual, right? That's not the thing. And history of family members with reading problems. That is sometimes a problem to see, because sometimes if you're coming from very low socioeconomic status or refugees, you cannot really know whether the parents had it or grandmother had it, because we know dyslexic is really genetics. So this is not something I really focus, because sometimes we just can't. We don't have this type of information. But pronunciation and those left and right issues that is going on for such a long time, those things I would really pay attention, because pronunciation problems are very specific based on your first language. So I do have some pronunciation problems for sure, right? Many Brazilian, and sometimes that's why when we speak, people say, oh, you're from Brazil, right? I know you're from Brazil because of your accent, right? When you're dyslexic, you don't have those same issues, right? So please pay attention to that. Now, something that happens with both, if you are dyslexic and bilingual, right? You can have some speech delay, right? That's something that might happen. Difficult recognizing sight words. So it's like, oh, you're always having problems. And usually, if you are a bilingual person, even if you have a very low call, right, a low call, we can see progress in sight words recognition, right? But if you are dyslexic and you're really struggling, and there's the different types of intervention, you don't see results. So that's why it's really important for you to see the first part and the second part, and so you can connect the dots, right? Difficult with word retrieval. You really cannot retrieve words, and that's something that you have to think about. And early difficult with letter names and sounds, right? So bilingual kids, they can struggle in the beginning, but the progress, especially the first 3 levels of language development for bilingual kids, are usually with the right intervention. It's usually really fast, especially with kids. I say that if with the right intervention, 1 year, the child can be from 1 to 3 very fast. Level 3 to level 4 it's where they struggle more because they can really survive. They can speak, they're very confident. So that's when they start struggling. So it takes a little bit more time to go from 3 to 4, sometimes 1 year, just for one level. And then 4 to 5 can be, again, faster depending on how the progress went from 3 to 4. But it's really important that bilingual kids don't usually take a long time. And if you have a very strong COP, you can move from level 1, which is basic, to intermediate, sometimes in 6 months. It's like, whoops, you know, I can go very fast. Okay, if he's not going very fast, pay attention on the intervention type of, you know, assessment the child is receiving. Okay. Another thing is trouble in rhyming. Bilingual kids love, like one of the things that I love doing with my bilingual kids, my bilingual students, and I worked with younger kids, with adults, you know, it's rhyming. Oh my God, it's one of the best things that we can do. They get it very fast. They learn faster with songs, you know, and we play hip hop, those kind of things, especially teenagers, they love it. If they are struggling, that's a red sign, right? Because usually that's not normal with bilingual kids, not normal at all, okay? All right, any questions? Do you have questions? I don't think so, right?
Nope, not right now.
I didn't hear anything. All right, so COP, now I want to focus a little bit on the academics, right? Why COP is really important, why the academic? So I love this tree picture because it really shows how one language is totally dependent on the other. You see the cup, the branch, from there we grow other languages. It could be 2, 3, 4, 5. You can have so many languages, always with one foundation, right? We always need that foundation. If we have a no COP, look what happens with the tree. It falls, right? It grows, you see the growth, right? Which is very exciting, but the more academic stuff, the more academic vocabulary, the more academic challenges, the tree just falls apart. And sometimes it takes 3, 4, and sometimes 5, but I'm sure by 5th grade, the child will show a lot of signs of difficulties when it comes to language because the tree, the branch is not strong enough. So there is no COP, there is no cup to support, there is no bridge. So it's gonna fall for sure. That's a fact. Sometimes it takes more years, sometimes it takes less years, depending on the child's difficulties, but something that we really need to pay attention, very close attention. So what is the role of the dominant language, right? Why is it so important to have a dominant language? And the dominant language, usually it could be the mother language, the native language, or it could be your second language, which the case of my daughter that I gave you the example. My daughter was born in the United States, but in the first 2 years of her life before she went to preschool, I always spoke in Portuguese with her. Never even exposed her to English, except turning on the radio and obviously the games, the toys, no TV, because as a psychologist, she never had TV before the age of 3, or iPads or anything, no technology at all. So the only English she was exposed was with the toys that would speak, hello, ABC, you know, those things. But her dominant language is English. There is no doubt about that. She speaks English for sure as a dominant language. But this branch of the dominant language, and let me go back here, you see the green part here, which is the dominant language, it's full of neurons and connections, right? That's where the support is going to happen to grow the next part of the tree, right? So that's where the brain is gonna compare and contrast about similarities, differences, level of transparency in the language, orthography of the language, prosody of the language, everything the brain needs to compare and contrast. And the brain needs a foundation, needs to see, okay, is this right? Is this different? Is this the same? You know, the brain needs that. It's really important. So you really need to focus on that, right? That's why COP is really important. So now, things to look for when we are talking about, for instance, level of language transparency, right? So when we have two languages and you're bilingual, we really, the brain is going to kind of trying to investigate if this language is transparent or not, or how similar, how difficult it is when we are learning a second language. So what is transparent language? Transparent languages are those where you read what you see, right? It's very consistent, like Spanish, Italian, whatever you see, all the vowel sounds, whatever you learn, it's there. Dyslexic kids, they have an easier time learning those languages, and sometimes they are even diagnosed later. So sometimes if you have a dyslexic child coming from Mexico or Spain, maybe this child was not even diagnosed because during, you know, kindergarten and first grade, they couldn't really see any difficulties in terms of reading or trying to decode, because it's kind of easier, right? The child is still struggle, but if you're not really a language expert, or if you don't pay close attention, it could be missed, right? You could, you know, not see what is going on. Now, if you are coming from a deep language, which means there is a lot of inconsistency, example, the English language, where we have 44 phonemes, but we have 120 graphemes. That is something that usually by kindergartner, if you are very good observer, the teacher might say, something's going on. And then first grade, the teacher may think again and say, I think this is something we should look more in depth, right? So if you have a bilingual child who was transferred from a more transparent language and trying to learn English, this child might struggle a lot. Then that's something you really need to pay attention and see whether you need to conduct a more thorough investigation to see whether this child might be dyslexic. You know, he's, you know, in Portuguese, and maybe talk to the mother. No, I don't think she's struggling in Portuguese, but in English, it's very hard. Now try to do some investigation, because it might, you might see something, right? So deep languages like French, Danish, and English, it's much harder for dyslexic, and transparent languages are easier. So I think I would really focus on that. So things to take into consideration when you're assessing a child and you know the first language or the dominant language is kind of transparent. So kids with transparent background, they will have less difficulty with word decoding. Their phonemic awareness problems are much less pronounced. You won't see that if you do an assessment in Spanish. That's not going to be a really big issue, right? It could be even average, the results, and may show fewer errors in terms of spelling, right? That's why we don't have spelling bee challenges in Portuguese, right? Or in Spanish, because you know, the mistakes would be much, you know, simpler, I would say, so we don't have that. So the first time I heard about spelling bees, like, whoa, is this crazy? But then after learning English, I could understand why you guys have spelling bee challenges. But in some languages, it does not even make sense, right? Because it's so obvious. We wouldn't do any challenge on that. However, if the child is really struggling when it comes to reading and have difficulties blending and rhyming, again, rhyme is key. The bilingual child is really having a hard time rhyming. Please, please, please stop. That's a red sign, red sign, because I love doing rhyming with my bilingual kids. regardless of their age, right? Hip hop is great, and dyslexic kids will have a hard time singing some hip hop songs, right? All right, do you have questions, Kathy? I think I heard maybe.
No questions right now.
Okay, perfect. All right, so the common misconceptions among educators when it comes to bilingualism is we tend to focus a lot on phonemic awareness. And we think this is a very important factor when it comes to diagnosing some things. For bilingual kids, it's something we should think about before. There are so many other areas that we can investigate. And obviously, I'm not saying not to do phonemic awareness, but don't put so much weight on phonemic awareness, especially if the child is coming from a very transparent language. And again, there are different spectrums of dyslexic, right? We have very mild to very severe, right? And I really sometimes focus on I tell teachers to focus on those mild ones, because if we do the intervention very early, it's going to be so much easier. And it's not just because he's dyslexic, we can say, oh, so you shouldn't speak another language, you know, you shouldn't be bilingual. There's no correlation with that. Yes, he's going to struggle a little bit more, but it doesn't matter. Like if you're dyslexic, you cannot be bilingual, right? That's not something we should tell parents at all, right? If you're having any language difficulties, okay? So this is just a chart to explain the depth of the language and how languages are much easier to understand. So for instance, the easiest one would be Finnish. It's a very shallow language, very simple. The structure, it's kind of, you know, not a problem. And then we have Greek, which is also easy to get it, you know, very straightforward. It's very interesting. Italian and Spanish. And then we have Portuguese, right? And that's why sometimes people say, oh, I can speak Spanish, I'm fluent in Spanish, but I have a hard time understanding Portuguese. That's why it's a little bit more deep, the Portuguese, in terms of, I would say, pronunciation and, you know, some sounds. And then we have French, and English is considered the more complex and in-depth language. So we do have, you know, kids who will struggle with English. So if you have a kid who's coming, who is bilingual, and first language is Finnish, right? Maybe this child was okay in Finnish. She had no issues, especially if she's young, and is struggling a lot in English. So try to really pay attention to other type of signs so you can really understand, right, what is going on, right? Another thing that can influence is the type of assessment, you know, for orthography. You know, so some languages like Chinese and English, they are very different in terms of orthography, non-alphabetic versus alphabetic language, transparent versus opaque languages. So try to really understand that. And those are just some ideas of how to assess more effectively those students if they come from those language backgrounds. Those are more easier to diagnose, I would say, a type of assessments. Okay, so in order to wrap it up, this long part of the webinar, things that can affect the child, right? Literacy level, first literacy, first language, the dominant language, literacy. So first dominant mother's language, you really have to know which one is more important. How well one reading skills are related to second language. The strengths and weaknesses on the language is also extremely important for you to understand. How L1 strengths will cross over with the development, because again, always remember there is a connection branch. There is always this bridge communicating, and sometimes the communication can be tricky. So try to think about that as well. The orthography of the language also influences the development of the language. So you really have to focus on that as well. The complexity of the language and the learner's oral proficiency, if it is BICS or not. This is something we really need to think about if we want to have the right diagnosis. Okay, all right, questions? Can I move on?
I do have a few questions coming in. If I can just start with the first one I've seen.
Okay, you can go ahead. I'm just
okay.
Here.
Okie doke.
Yeah.
The first question, English and Hawaiian use the same alphabet. Do you think a child with dyslexia who is already having a difficult time reading and writing in English will have an even more difficult time learning to read and write if they are to do so in both languages?
Okay, so good question. So my answer is, we do not need to focus on reading and writing on both languages at the same time, especially if you're dealing with dyslexic. I would focus on literacy on one language to really make sure there is a strong foundation. The literacy level of reading and writing will transfer automatically. Like for me, for instance, when I learned Portuguese, I learned English later on when I was old. I didn't have to learn how to read and write again in English, right? I just transferred all these skills. It's much faster because I already have these skills. Obviously, my brain's gonna compare and contrast, but it's much quicker. The process of becoming biliterate in two languages is so hard, even for average children, with no cognitive challenges. It's so hard. It takes longer on average for monolingual students. It takes, you learn how to read and write by the end of 4th grade, right? By 5th grade is where you're gonna put into test if you really know how to read, right? That's when the problems start showing off. But if you're teaching to read and write in 2 languages at the same time, it's gonna take at least 7 to 8 years. That's why dual language programs, they need to offer dual language programs until 7th or 8th grade, usually until 8th grade, because they're gonna struggle a lot in the beginning. You don't need to do that. So I would focus again on the BICS, on the speaking aspect of the language, especially if he is or she is dyslexic, because you don't need to do that at all. They want to communicate. And then if they do want to read and write, they can do that. It's going to be easier, even though he's, there are going to be some challenges because he is dyslexic, but it's going to be much easier doing later. All right?
Thank you, Carla. I'm going to provide a little bit of background for this next question. I have a student who has been in the US for 3 years, and I'm working with phonemic awareness. The child struggles with rhyming. He has a hard time decoding even the CVC words. They speak English at home. I was reading a Dr. Seuss book, The Cat in the Hat, for 3 days, and the child struggles applying reading strategies. He is at a level A. I was told that rhyming skills will come over time. What would you recommend for the next step?
Well, there are some red flags going on there, right? Next steps, I would definitely do a more thorough investigation on the background history, language history. If there is some deficits in terms of language exposure and reading, trying to read other books as well in terms of comprehension, short-term memory retention. I would definitely do that, but I think this child is bringing some interesting red flags that I would definitely investigate. If you do want to, again, talk more about it, we can. but I would, investigate first the historical background, language background, terms of COLP. And I'm going to talk about some interesting assessment tools that you can use with this child as well.
Thank you, Carla. The next two questions kind of relate to the last slide. I'll just kind of combine them. First, if we could just go back to that slide, if we are able to, with the type of orthography and assessment measure. And then also within this slide, is Japanese considered a transparent language?
It depends. Japanese has two types of languages. It's the kanji, I forgot the name, but there's two different languages, or I don't know, I forgot the name. But anyways, one is more transparent and the other one is more complex. So it's kanji, and I forgot. I don't know if somebody knows the two names, but anyways, somebody can help me.
I'm looking them up. One is Kansi, the dialect, and there's a few, so I don't want to speak out of knowledge in this area.
Okay, yeah, I know it's kanji. So it really depends. Again, there are some, like in China and in Japan, you really have to know what language they're bringing, because some of the languages, they are more transparent, some are more complex, like Chinese. It's a very complex language. Like Mandarin's really complex. So usually dyslexic kids really struggle a lot, right? So we have to conduct an in-depth investigation. So if the majority of your bilingual kids are from Japan or China, you really have to investigate. I know that Chinese, most of them, if not all of them that I'm familiar, because there are different dialects there, it's really complex. It's a challenging for dyslexic kids. But Japan, I do know some are easier than others, so you have to investigate on that for sure.
Thank you. And I did have a few of our participants share some of those dialects, and I may not pronounce them correctly: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Thank you to Lisa Nakamura. Thank you. And that's it for our, one more question, just to kind of on this particular topic. You had mentioned 5 to 7 years of intervention. The question was wondering how much intervention you recommend on a weekly basis.
Well, again, it really, if you're talking to a child, let's suppose it's really with low or no COLP, I would say every day. It has to be an everyday intervention. Every single day you have to, build up, because again, the child is coming with no COLP at all. So we have to run, because the other students are also growing their academic vocabulary. So it has to be every single day with intervention. There is no choice. If I'm just taking assumption that it's zero COLP, for example, refugees. Okay, any more questions?
Carla? Nope, you are covering them all.
Perfect. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So why this is important? So I'm just going to give a language background. Well, because when we're talking about dyslexic kids, the common learning difficulties that can cause problems with reading, writing, and spelling. So we are talking about the academic language. We're talking about COLP. So whenever we are, trying to diagnose or to assess or to see if the dyslexic child is, or if the child is indeed dyslexic or only bilingual, we really have to go into the COLP, the academic language. We really need to investigate. We really need to go back and study the past history, the language past history, not, but, if you read how many minutes per day, how much TV is also something extremely important to ask parents, because TV does affect, or iPads or technology. It does affect attention, short-term memory. It does affect reading, writing skills. So all of those things are really important because sometimes it's not dyslexic, but you know, it's more an attention problem due to so much technology, right? So we really have to investigate more the past, because dyslexic is a COLP problem, academic problem. It's not just about books, right? Especially dyslexic kids, they speak, you know, they love to, you know, talk, and, you know, they're very smart, very creative, right? So we have to investigate the academic language for sure, right? So we just some data for you that I would like to share. Approximately 15% of kids are dyslexic. Children with dyslexia, usually they do also have some type of learning disabilities. So that's something we also have to think about, you know, so there are other areas, sometimes that's why it's hard. It happens all over the world in all different languages. Some languages are harder than others, but it doesn't matter. And they do have some, usually 25 to 40% of dyslexic do have some problems with attention, with focusing. So that's something we also need to think about when doing some type of diagnosis, right, with dyslexic. Another thing that I also mentioned during the presentation is that dyslexic people, the spectrum is really wide. We have mild to very severe types of dyslexic. So I usually worried a lot about those mild and moderate dyslexic, especially if you're dyslexic and bilingual and you're mild. You are in that zone that's kind of, you know, educators tend to wait a lot. If you're very severe, you're gonna show like signs very clear in the beginning. But for those that are mild and you're coming from a bilingual household, you know, we tend to wait a lot. So I want you guys, when you leave this webinar, to really think more carefully. If you do see some red signs, you know, even if it's just 3 or 4, try to investigate more to really understand whether it is really a mild, because if we do an intervention, especially as a neuropsychologist, early on, it's going to be much easier for the child, much easier, right, for them to succeed academically. So please pay attention to those behaviors that you can observe and can see, and you can just start collecting the data, because it's really important. Okay, so what do I do? So now let's talk about how we can assess. Now it's more hands-on because we're almost done, right? What are the best approach or ways to diagnose? So for me, it's a combination of methods. As a psychologist, and that's why I decided to have my own consulting, I never enjoyed spending 3, 4, 5 hours testing a child. So I created my own way of testing and assessing children in a way that is fun, interactive, and I can really see the child as a whole, right? So methods has to be various methods, usually very creative, try to have fun, but things that we cannot forget: interview, ask parents, ask teachers, ask aunties and uncles and whoever knows this child, ask questions. It's really important. Investigate, intervene, and get informed. Really get informed about, okay, what else can I learn about this child? Don't just say, oh, he's bilingual, he speaks this language, you know, really dive into the language, the COLP, the academic part of the language, okay? So commonalities. Red flags: have a hard time learning tools, difficulties reading clock with hands, confusion with left and right, rhyming, right, is something that is really important. Other ones that sometimes we cannot have access, which is family members' background in terms of dyslexic or not. Multiple ear infections, sometimes we don't know that, and could be other reasons as well. Other ones that are, read very slowly, are poor spellers. They can be kind of not really direct, have weak phonemic awareness depending on your language background, so those are some symptoms that you can investigate more. So yes, phonemic awareness skills is really poor. Let's investigate more and collect data and, write down whatever you find, because sometimes bilingual might have those difficulties as well. Read slower, they're poor spellers, they struggle sounding out words in the beginning. So this is really normal for bilingual kids as well, but it's not normal for bilingual kids to not rhyme, right? So I would definitely compare and contrast those things when we are diagnosing a bilingual child who we might think might be dyslexic, okay? So early signs. So let's talk about the early signs. Speech delay, often can understand language, but it usually has some struggle with speaking. Dominant hand, right? Sometimes it takes a while for them to decide. Confusion with left and right, odd pronunciation. Again, the pronunciation is very specific to dyslexic, not bilingual. Difficult word retrieval, which could be a bilingual issue. Trouble finding words, which might be sometimes with bilingual. Rhyming, and early difficulty with letter and names. Now, the good thing is games. I am sharing with you guys, usually how do I assess my kids? I play games, a lot of games, because usually they're not stressed, they're emotional, they're like really relaxed, they can get into the game, and I can do great types of assessments while playing the games. Like, I love this game, I don't know if you know, like the left and right, where you tell a story. If you hear a word, you have to do left or right. It's a very interesting game. We're working with left and right skills. We're working with short memory. So there's a lot of things that we can do with this game. We can collect a lot of data. We have games on nursery rhymes, which dyslexic kids do struggle. The polar bear, what do you hear? So these are just some games that I usually use with kids. They have fun, and I can collect very insightful data to really see if it's a bilingual issue and or a dyslexic issue. Now for elementary kids, we have, again, the same, if the elementary kids have the same problems as that list, but adds to a lot of difficulties learning the address. They still don't know how to write their names. They're really struggling with phone numbers, sounding out letters, difficulty learning multiplication tables, right? Continued difficulties with retrieving words, and poor handwriting skills, issues still with dominance language, dominance right or left-handed. Those are the things that we have to pay attention. And here's some excellent games for elementary, like row and rhyme. Dyslexic kids don't like that game, and bilingual kids usually love that game. So I usually like to compare, because there are a lot of games that kids love, bilingual kids love, but some games that I would see if you're dyslexic, you're gonna struggle. It's interesting because they have fun, but they struggle, right? So I can see that they are in a very low stress zone, but you're like, oh, I don't like this. The Zingo game, I love the Zingo games to do it, So just, have fun. And so those are just some suggestions. And we have high schoolers, again, if they are in high school and still do not have a diagnosis, again, it's the same problems, but they are poor testing skills. They are really struggling, remember, difficulty with foreign languages. They're like, I don't like languages, those type of things. Directions, terrible with directions, right? And I do play a game with directions with my bilingual students in high school. It's so fun, so interesting that we go into the hall and say, turn right, turn left, and then they have to find a secret room. It's very interesting, very interactive, and I'm kind of observing at the same time and see what is going on inside their heads, which is interesting. Scrabble, we have games, which usually some kids will not like it at all. Memory games, so some of those games are kind of also, it works for lower grades, but the story cubes are so nice to, talk about, summary, to summarize and to do some revisions about what you read. Very interesting. Hangman, everybody likes Hangman. So just some interesting games that I would like to share with you guys, because that's how I assess. I don't like, as a psychologist, I never liked assessing and giving those boring tests. So I kind of start paying attention. Here at home, I have like 300 different games that I use to assess kids, depending on the age, so those educational games are very fun. I highly recommend, right? So let's wrap it up. Because we are almost, actually I passed a little bit. So there are different levels of bilingualism. Those are the things I want you guys to remember. Different levels of bilingualism. The first 5 years are crucial. Remember, 90% of our brain has grown during those 5 years. Language foundation is key. Pay attention to the call, right? Bix and call proficiency need to be investigated. COP 1 and COP 2, how they are intertwined, how they're correlated. Let's focus on that as well. So the 4 I's: interview, investigate, intervene, and get informed. This is really, really important. And assessments can be fun. We can have fun and we can start trying to diagnose in a much faster way, easier way, and fun way with our kids. Okay? Questions? Do we have more questions? I think, or no?
We have one more that I just want to make sure, and Carly did an amazing job fielding questions throughout the entire presentation.
Oh, I'm almost finished.
Oh, one more question. What would you suggest for a student whose native language is English, was in Hawaiian language immersion school through 2nd grade, has articulation difficulties?
Okay, so well, I would try to see why this person's having articulation difficulties. It's only in Hawaiian or in English as well? She didn't say, right?
His native language is English, but was in a Hawaiian language immersion school through 2nd grade.
Yeah, but,
So but articulation difficulties. Lisa, if you wanted to articulate that. Oh, English. Thank you, Lisa.
So, so is he struggling with English, not Hawaiian?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, again, the fact that his native English language is English, we really need, again, to see the depth of the language. The English language is only Bix, because sometimes, there are many students who say, instead of ask, X, instead of ask the question, X the question. So, it's just because of lack of listening input. So I would definitely try to investigate more if it is a more lack of language input exposure to the listening skills, or because they mix the language a lot, which could be another factor. Sometimes you speak Hawaiian and then English, and the child is kind of struggling to figure it out which one is more, which one's dominant, right? We really need to figure out what is the dominant language in this child, if there is one, because sometimes there is not yet one, because it's a second grade. What happens sometimes if there is no dominant, it's kind of, the child is floating on both languages. There is nothing underneath. This child is child, so we really need to build up a foundation. So those are my suggestions.
Thank you, Carla. And one last question, as it just popped up here. I noticed throughout the presentation, you regularly referenced levels. The participant was wondering what leveling scale you were using.
Okay, so level 1. So usually, so I used the in the United States, when a bilingual child is assessed, we have level 1, which is basic level, and level 2 is, level 3 is the intermediate level, and level 5 is the advanced level of language development. So what I said is usually, on average, the child takes 1 year to move from basic level, which means no English proficiency, to the intermediate level, which is level 3, in 1 year. That's normal, because the first intermediate, basic to intermediate level, the growth happens very fast. Then from intermediate to upper intermediate, that's where kids struggle a little bit, because there is more complexity. We're learning more the passive voice, for instance, you know, the use of more complex grammatical structures in English, and that might take a while to understand. But you know, this growth between no speaking skills in English to intermediate usually happens very fast, from 0 to intermediate. Level 3 is intermediate.
Thank you so much, Carla. I wish we had more time for questions, but we are going to wrap up. There's a few things we want to share with our participants. I'm just going to unhide myself. Okay. First and foremost, thank you so much, Dr. Garjaka, for this in-depth, engaging presentation about the impact of bilingualism, and specifically with dyslexia. Thank you for covering that very detailed and really connecting with us and our participants this evening. Thank you so much. We're grateful, very, very grateful to have gained this new knowledge on the potential causes and the impact of the late diagnosis. So thank you again.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Before we close this evening, we would like to share a little more about our upcoming free community events. October 10th, we have a teacher workshop, Bring the Science of Reading to Life in the Classroom, presented by Really Great Reading. October 21st, Dyslexia 24/7 panel presentation for parents, teachers, tutors, and other professionals to hear personal and family perspectives on living with dyslexia. October 26th, our virtual Kids Halloween event, a follow-up to Haida's successful July 13th virtual kids event. As always, we invite you to follow us on Facebook, visit our YouTube channel to watch previously recorded webinars and other short informational videos, and subscribe to Haida's free electronic newsletter to receive resources and information about future presentations and workshops to support and teach struggling readers. And your personal gift will support Haida's mission in continuing to offer quality, free, or low-cost events, such as this evening's webinar. You may also sign up to receive Haida's free e-news and make a donation at the Haida website. And please see the links on our screen. Participants, on the next slide, you will see the link to complete our brief evaluation survey for this webinar with 8 questions. We appreciate your feedback. It is helpful as we develop and plan future webinars and workshops. We'll leave this survey link up for a few more minutes for those of you who may want to jump into it and finish it right up. Thank you again, everyone, for spending the evening with Dr. Garjaka and HIDA members. On behalf of HIDA and the program committee, we sincerely thank Dr. Carla Garjaka for sharing her time and expertise with us tonight. And special thanks again to HIDA's Executive Director, Margaret Higa, Board of Directors and Program Committee member, Dr. Kimball McCann, and also Lisa Nakamura, board member joining us this evening, and Jennifer Leowicki, and all the participants for your time and commitment to helping struggling readers. Have a wonderful evening. Please stay safe. Mahalo.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.